Welcome back. We hope that you have enjoyed your sessions and the discussions that you have had, and also that you have had a little nice break.
So up next is a panel called The Process of the US Cyberspace Solarium Commission, moderated by information security doctoral candidate Amy Erton, a former non-resident visiting scholar at the CCDCOE. Please, Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Henrik. Thank you, Lina. Welcome, everyone, to the final panel of CyCon 2021. I'm delighted to welcome three fantastic speakers to join me today to discuss the US Cyberspace Solarium Commission. The Commission, established in the 2019 National Defense Act, was assembled to develop a strategy and associated policy recommendations that would help the US defend itself against the threat of major cyber attacks. This panel will review the process of the Commission's undertaking, as well as its successes in implementing legislation and policy changes. I'll shortly introduce our speakers, and we'll go into a presentation from each speaker before opening up to questions. To everyone watching, we welcome you to input your questions as we go along, using the chat function on the bottom right of your screen. Let's get started. It's a pleasure to welcome our three presenters today. In order of presentation, we will hear first from Dr. Erika Burkhardt. Erika is Senior Fellow in the Technology and International Affairs Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Erika also continues to serve as a Senior Director on the US Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Erika will speak to us today about the need for and the start of the Commission. We will then hear from Dr. Brandon Valeriano. Brandon is the Donald Bren Chair of Military Innovation at the Marine Corps University. He also serves as Senior Advisor to the Cyber Solarium Commission and is a Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. Brandon has a paper in this year's conference proceedings, co-authored with Professor Benjamin Jensen, entitled Building a National Cyber Strategy, the Process and Implications of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission Report, which he will discuss with us today. We are delighted to welcome Admiral Mark Montgomery as our final speaker. Mark is the Senior Advisor to the Chairman of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and was previously the Executive Director. Mark is also the Senior Director of the Center for Cyber and Technology Innovation, the Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and has previously served as Policy Director for the Senate Armed Services Committee, as well as completing 32 years as a US Navy-trained nuclear surface warfare officer. Thank you all for joining us today, and without further ado, I will pass on to Erika to begin.
Great, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to sort of open this panel by talking about how the Commission was established and what the motivation was behind its creation, and then Brandon will get into a bit more detail about the process of the Commission itself. So, Amy, as you mentioned, the Commission was created in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. It's a congressional commission, and it was a bipartisan commission. So it had 14 commissioners who came from both Democratic and Republican parties across members of Congress, the executive branch, and the private sector. And its purpose was to develop a comprehensive strategy and also a set of meaningful and implementable policy recommendations to defend the United States against cyber attacks of significant consequence. And a big part of the motivation behind its establishment was this general recognition that the United States lacked a comprehensive cyber strategy anchored sort of at the highest level that could drive implementation across different elements of the government. Even though there were sort of different strategic documents across different parts of the government, there wasn't one comprehensive perspective. And in particular, that sort of the absence of this cyber strategy at sort of the highest level of government meant that there wasn't a mechanism for sort of clearly articulating and defining roles and responsibilities and how different subordinate elements are supposed to be operating. And so, to me, what really stands out is that, around the time of the Commission's creation, there was essentially sort of strategic fragmentation or confusion within the government, at least from my perspective. So, I think a few examples kind of illustrate this point. On the one hand, you had the 2018 National Cyber Strategy, which articulated this idea of preserving peace through strength, and then also called out the State Department's Cyber Deterrence Initiative, which was focused on figuring out how to impose different types of consequences for actions that were seen as violating different norms of behavior. At the same time, though, around the same time, U.S. Cyber Command released its 2018 Command Vision, which came out before the Department of Defense debuted its updated cyber strategy, so the 2018 strategy, which was an update of its 2015 strategy. And the Cyber Command Vision seemed to sort of reject the idea of cyber deterrence entirely, even though the National Cyber Strategy was explicitly grounded in a logic of deterrence. And instead, the Command Vision advocated this concept of cyber persistence, which became sort of formulated into this idea of persistent engagement. Shortly after that, the Department of Defense introduced its 2018 cyber strategy, which contained this concept of defend forward. And according to the summary that was released of that strategy, the idea behind defend forward was that U.S. cyber forces should be, rather than be in sort of a reactive posture, should be operating, as close to the adversary as possible to learn about their evolving capabilities and their TTPs, and when appropriate and authorized, take action to disrupt, deny, or degrade their offensive capabilities and the infrastructure that's used to enable them. And at the time, it wasn't entirely clear to external observers, at least, how these concepts of defend forward and persistent engagement were meant to relate to one another, because both contain sort of similar logics and ideas. Or sort of more importantly, how they related to the broader national strategy, which was anchored in the idea of deterrence. So there seemed to be this sort of inherent tension, perhaps confusion or lack of a cohesive strategic vision. So that was sort of an important gap that the Cyberspace Solarium Commission was aiming to fill at the strategic level. And what the commission set out to do was to reconcile these different approaches, and in doing so, articulate a national strategy that could bring more cohesion and unity to how the U.S. government was thinking about and implementing cyber strategy and policy. But I also think it's important to point out, and I imagine that Mark will talk about this in a bit more detail, that the commission wasn't only about the strategy itself, it was also very much focused on implementation. So I don't remember which commissioner it was who said it, but one of our commissioners liked to say that we had a bias toward action. So the strategy is the foundation of the commission's report, but equally, if not more important, are also the policy actions, especially the legislative provisions that the commission was able to help get into the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act. And so that's where the structure of the commission became so important for us, because we had 4 active members of Congress across both parties and across the House and the Senate, which is somewhat unusual for a congressional commission, and was really instrumental in our legislative success. But to go back to the sort of the commission's approach and the purpose for its establishment, so it was really meant to fill the sort of gap in existing cyber strategy. And the commission drew its name and its sort of inspiration from President Eisenhower's Project Solarium, which took place in the early days of the Cold War, and reflected a process that President Eisenhower established to develop a strategy for addressing the emerging Soviet threat. So under Eisenhower's Project Solarium, there were sort of 3 different task forces, each focused on a different lens toward grand strategy with respect to the Soviet Union. One sort of became kind of the containment task force, another focused on nuclear deterrence, and then the third focused on more of a hardline approach, which we now may associate with the idea of rollback. And so, the idea behind drawing this inspiration from the early days of the Cold War is that even though we're in the contemporary environment has many different characteristics from the nature of the Cold War challenge, it represents clearly systemic and urgent challenges. So, of course, there are a number of differences. Now in cyberspace, we face a multitude of threat actors at different levels of capability and with different strategic motivations. The strategic environment is not one that's characterized by the threat of sort of cataclysmic violence that would come from the use of nuclear weapons, but rather more sort of routine, malicious, corrosive behavior that takes place most of the time below a use of force threshold. And then another big difference is the role of the private sector, both as a target of malicious attacks, as well as the owner and operator of most of the infrastructure that private actors and the government rely on for all different types of things. So on the one hand, the strategic environment is sort of quite different, but on the other hand, it's a similarly sort of systemic challenge. And so the commission organized itself drawing from Eisenhower's organization and his process for Project Solarium. So we were organized into 3 different task forces, which Brandon will talk about in more detail in a few minutes. But essentially, the task forces were meant to represent the primary strands of thinking in different circles about U.S. cyber strategy. So Task Force 1 was focused on active disruption, defend forward, persistent engagement. Task Force 2 was focused on denial and resilience and defense, and Task Force 3 focused on engagement and norms. And then there was a 4th directorate that explored cross-cutting issues. And so again, Brandon will get into the process a bit more in a few minutes, but I won't get into the details here. But essentially, after an extensive process of research and outreach by the different task forces, each task force produced a unique report. The reports were subjected to red team analysis by external experts and further refined. There was a comprehensive exercise that was organized around different scenarios. And then, long story short, what emerged from this process was a strategy of layered cyber deterrence. And this is the anchoring strategy for the Commission's report and is what drives the 80+ policy recommendations that are found in it. So I'll close my remarks by talking briefly about the logic of layered cyber deterrence, and I'm happy to talk more about that concept in greater detail in Q&A. So essentially, layered cyber deterrence, I would say, is anchored in a few core assumptions. The first is that deterrence is actually possible in cyberspace. So you had this sort of prior debate in U.S. policy and strategy circles about whether or not deterrence works and it's possible and it's feasible or worthwhile. And the Commission very much came down on the side of deterrence being possible. However, it was clear that we need to have a more nuanced understanding of how deterrence might operate differently at different thresholds. And so it doesn't make sense to take a binary sort of all or nothing approach to whether cyber deterrence works, but rather identify the conditions under which it might work and the conditions under which we need different types of tools paired to different types of deterrence challenges. And so, above the use of force threshold or the level of armed attack, we've sort of already seen cyber deterrence succeeding. And that's largely probably due to the credible threat of retaliation sort of across the spectrum using cyber and non-cyber instruments. The challenge is really below that threshold. And so the Commission, essentially argued that we need to sort of rethink how we define deterrence sort of below that threshold and sort of question whether it makes sense to define successful deterrence outcomes as being a complete absence of malicious activity, which was the metric for nuclear deterrence for obvious reasons, but rather focus on a reduction in their magnitude and their frequency. So that's sort of the first core assumption of layered cyber deterrence. The second is that the best form of cyber deterrence is deterrence by denial. So you kind of have these 3 different visions of deterrence or mechanisms of deterrence: deterrence by punishment, deterrence by denial, and deterrence by entanglement. And while layered cyber deterrence contains sort of all of these mechanisms of deterrence, the bulk of the strategy is oriented around the logic of denial, which means sort of improving your own defenses and resilience and making it harder for adversaries to conduct malicious behavior. The third core assumption is that the private sector has to be systematically incorporated into national security strategy as a key stakeholder. And it seems sort of obvious to say in a cyber context, but it's an important innovation, I think, in thinking about national security strategy more broadly, because that's just simply not the typical orientation. And then finally, all instruments of national power are sort of imported, not just cyber tools. And so those are sort of the core assumptions of layered cyber deterrence. And the vision really is these sort of three different layers that operate in different proportions at different thresholds. So at the highest threshold, the focus is more on cost imposition, mostly through the use of military instruments. Below that threshold, the focus is really on denial and resilience. And then sort of at the far left of the spectrum, most of the focus is on norms development and shaping behavior through diplomatic means and engagement. The way that the Commission aimed to sort of reconcile defend forward and layered cyber deterrence is that defend forward is something that operates sort of across that spectrum and is focused on maneuvering in cyberspace to collect information about adversary behavior and intent and capabilities, and to share that with sort of domestic stakeholders in the sort of denial and resilience bucket of the spectrum to enable defense, and sort of in a limited way support the cost imposition aspect of the strategy. So that's sort of the intent behind the Commission's founding and where the Commission ended up in terms of a strategic perspective. And happy to talk about any more of this in Q&A, but I'll turn the mic over to Brandon to talk more about the process itself.
Perfect. Thank you, Erica, for setting out such a brilliant context, assumptions, and key concepts when we're talking about the Commission. Brandon, over to you, and I believe you have slides as well, so we'll bring those up.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Always a big fan of CyCon, and I miss being there in person, but hopefully we'll be able to do it in person next year. I'm going to build a little bit on what Erica was saying, and basically I'm going to skip my first two slides. But I think to introduce the paper that's in the conference proceedings is meant to be paired with the Solarium report. And the two things together are a lasting document of our work, a lasting document of the process of the Commission. And I think that's the key thing we wanted to get across with this article is the details of strategy development. We tend to not talk about the nuts and bolts of constructing a strategy. And I think one of the big problems is knowledge of how to construct a strategy, especially in a highly politically charged era. Is knowledge held by a few people. And the idea behind this paper is to democratize that, to be very open about our process and how we came about our conclusions. And more importantly, in this report, in this paper, to talk about risk management. So let me skip to two slides, and that'll leave us on the process slide. And, as Erica mentioned, we had 3 different task forces, but before we get there, the goal is that absence of a process to evaluate ideas and test assumptions, strategy formation often devolves into a competing process of bureaucratic interest. And that's what we wanted to avoid. And we are very happy to have avoided that in the Solarium Commission, in that, the Graham Allison perspective of where you sit didn't really determine what the Commission was doing. It certainly determined what people were saying when they gave us advice and when we consulted them. But basically, everyone kind of came in as equals once we entered the door. But the goal was to avoid the garbage can of ideas, which is a literal citation in this field. And it often happens when these commissions, these reports, these evaluation processes just put everything into the bucket and kind of hope it all works out. And that obviously doesn't work very well. We tried to establish a clear and deliberative process to guard against agenda setting. as well as to check some common sources of bias. And that was the key thing for us. So, of course, the first thing was to build out the executive director, who was Mark Montgomery, and the chief of staff, who was Colonel Deb Grays, I believe. And then we went to the task force leads, which, of course, Erica Bogart was another one. Val Coalfield from the FBI led Task Force 3, and John Costello led Task Force 2. We also had the senior research director, who was Ben Jensen, my co-author, who is currently deployed in combat right now, so he can't be there with us. And then, of course, we filled out the rest of the staff with think tanks, Capitol Hill staff, academia, basically everyone who potentially could leverage their knowledge and abilities to support the commission. We had a very truncated and short timeline. I forget exactly how long it was, but it was basically within a year. We went from briefings to writing the report to coalescing around the report to the war game to the final actual report. And then we actually dropped the report on March 2020, which of course became a momentous month in international history for many other reasons besides the commission report. But we did our best to promote and to push out the report as best possible. The strategy formation process, it was not a carbon copy of the Eisenhower Solarium process. We were a bit more open and a bit more deliberative in terms of how we went about doing things. And the goal, of course, was to build towards commission approval. We were focused on research questions, and we had a fairly extensive research phase with over 300 interviews, 300 submissions from academia and think tanks, and multiple trips to Israel, to Silicon Valley, to New York, to Europe. We had a team go visit CyCon and CCDCOE. And in the end, the task force strategy was focused on taking us from individual task force reports to a red team, to a report, and then the Solarium Commission report. The event, we kind of focused on this event, and I'm kind of surprised I don't remember the date of the event at this point. Maybe someone else can help me out with that later. But that was the goal. That was the end state for a lot of us. And the actual event where we developed and presented our ideas as a team combined elements of red teaming, matrix wargaming, and stress tests to allow the commissioners to evaluate each task force and each recommendation. We had two scenarios, slow burn and break glass. Slow burn was a series of small minor cuts that would lead to something important and devastating in cybersecurity. And break glass was a break glass, an emergency massive cyber event. In some ways, it actually mimicked the solar winds event that happened a few months later. Observations. The goal of the victory condition, as Erica mentioned, is to ensure connectivity required in modern society remains stable despite cyber operations. So the goal was to reduce the severity of attacks below the threshold of armed conflict. We were never going to deter all cyber attacks. That's off the table, basically. And in many ways, the concept of deterrence has doesn't have very many intellectual correlation with the Cold War concept of deterrence. It's something a little bit different. And of course, shaping the international environment and entanglement in norms became a very important core concept for our strategy. And then, of course, we have denial, defense in being, and defense in depth, which was critical to enabling resiliency and survival of basic attacks. And then also we had to enable the DoD, and that was about restoring cost imposition to our national strategy, which was technically removed under persistent engagement. We also spoke quite a bit, and we'll be developing more work in the future on the critical importance of signaling the vision, of clarity of the strategy. Because if we don't know what the strategy means in the United States, how are our allies and our adversaries supposed to understand the strategy? So that was very much critical for us. The legislative strategy was very important in terms of implementation. And I think every other working group, every other commission, they don't exactly think about implementation. And this is what was critical, and this is what allowed us to be successful in any sort of metric sense. We had 52 legislative proposals. That was cut down from over 150 during the Solarium Matrix war game. and 27 of them were implemented in the 2021 NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, where we fund the military budget. Failures were basically due to either running out of time, because we had a short 8-month process, or competing bureaucratic interests. And we're working to enable the remaining 25 or so recommendations in the 2022 NDAA. And once that's done, I'm sure Mark will talk about this, but I think at that point, the Commission's work will kind of roll up. We were very much critically focused on enabling the DoD to achieve its goals. And that's become recent news, where there's going to be more budget allocated to the DoD to expand the cyber mission forces. But more importantly, we needed to enable CISA, the cybersecurity infrastructure organization, and that's part of the DHS, to conduct defensive operations. The DoD, based on their authorities, is basically focused on offensive and forward-moving operations to disrupt adversaries, while the the DHS and CISA is focused on defensive operations. We also recommend the State Department build out their efforts, and there's going to be a Cyber Diplomacy Act that will probably make its way through Congress over the next few months or even days. And finally, most importantly, was the National Cyber Director position, which was just nominated a few months ago for Chris Inglis. And the idea was to restore and elevate a commissioner for all government efforts to establish a whole-of-nation strategy. That we needed to have something outside of the DoD and NSC to enable freedom of action and to deconflict between the various branches. Pressure points and risk management is very much critical. One, of course, we wanted to move beyond the basic idea of deterrence. And the focus is on the reduction of attacks, not stopping all attacks. We also needed to establish a causal mechanism to achieve desired ends, and that's cost of position, denial, and entanglement strategies. So we had 3 causal mechanisms, basically. We were also very much concerned about the dangers of escalation risk, and me and Erica have done a lot of work on escalation risks. And this is very important for us to avoid the interactive process that comes with conflict spirals and security dilemmas. And this can be done through denial efforts and communication efforts, particularly signaling efforts. We're working now very hard in the U.S. system to enable breach data reporting. And that's going to be important because we need to understand baselines and the scope of cybersecurity activity. We can't know if our strategy is effective unless we measure the effectiveness of the strategy. And we also, through the NDA last year, subsection 1744, established a national cyber exercise, a war game of sorts to check progress. And that's important for mitigating risk. Path forward, to wrap up, the Commission established a roadmap for national strategy development that can be a model for others, other states to develop a strategy in cybersecurity, and for other levers of government power to develop strategies. But for us, research, evidence, and data were very much critical, not speculation, not bringing up the tropes. And, we're not going to recommend a cyber letter of marque or something like that. These spectacular things that don't exactly do anything. We're focused on evidence. And the other focus was to avoid whole-of-nation strategies. To focus on whole-of-nation strategies and avoid whole-of-department strategies, because we needed to build out more for the U.S. government besides just enabling the DoD. The process model of strategic reform avoids bipartisanship and many of the pathologies of the past, and we're very proud of our efforts because during a heightened political time, the Commission very much seemed devoid of partisanship. And that gave me confidence as an American that we can move forward in this country and avoid some of these disputes and partisan bickering. But in many ways, implementation and creating conditions for success for the most important attribute for success. Maybe the strategy will live on. Maybe the strategy will become an efficient part of U.S. government doctrine. But the most important and lasting thing will be the legislative success and the things that we enable technically through the NDA. And that's important. And that's something that people need to remember when they develop strategies, because you can say something, but how you actually behave and how you actually enable a strategy is more important than what you write down on paper. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Amy.
Thank you, Brandon, for taking us through that journey. And in light of your comments about transparency and the importance for that, it's brilliant to see this journey and your paper in this year's proceedings. Perfect. So on to Mark.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to CCDCOE for sponsoring this. And we certainly, I want to reemphasize that they were very helpful to us during our investigative phase in late 2019 when we had a number of our staffers visit there, and then followed up with interviews afterwards. So I'll try not to be repetitive on my two colleagues. So as I go through this, what I would say is I would step back for one moment into what Erica was talking about and say that if I looked at if I thought there were three things about layered cyber deterrence, our strategic recommendation, and to recall, we were required to both make a strategic recommendation for how to better defend our national critical infrastructure from significant cyber attack and the legislative proposal. So what both Erica and Brandon have now talked about. But I would highlight three areas where we said, look, in addition to kind of your typical Joseph Nye description of deterrence, layered cyber deterrence requires three specific investments. First, you absolutely have to invest in your defense. As Erica mentioned, this is something we don't have to do, traditionally in cruise missile defense or jet fighter defense in the United States or anti-submarine warfare. We have the luxury of 4,000 miles of the Atlantic, 7,000 miles of the Pacific, stable allies in Canada and Mexico. We really had a significant advantage going back either 70 years, if you want to go all the way back to 1815, over 200 years. But, cyber in a moment removed that geographic advantage. So we really do have to invest in your defense. And that was something we weren't doing. The second critical element is that defense is owned and the system you're defending is owned and operated by the private sector, not by the government, whereas the government owns every plane, tank, submarine, aircraft carrier. We don't own the public infrastructure. And if we do, it's at the state and local level. So we really do have to build a better public-private collaboration. So that was step two. And then step three was we needed to continue, we had to instantiate the idea of defend forward and make sure that we looked at it and with all its attributes, not just the military ones, but the economic, sanctions, the law enforcement indictments, and the diplomatic activity, and bring it together. So we definitely understood it was a mix of offensive and defensive solutions. I do think in 2020, Brandon said we passed 25 of our recommendations came out in 27 different legislative provisions. In other words, 27 small laws, which is quite a bit. But we were limited in the areas we were successful. We were very successful, I think, in reorganizing the government. So that's creating the National Cyber Director, certainly a signpost we took from a number of our allies and partners that have a principal senior person in the proximity of the national leader who is uniquely responsible for cyber. So we created the National Cyber Director. We strengthened CISA, and there's a real argument there. CISA was not working in a number of infrastructure areas that it was not achieving its appropriate effect. Now, part of that is it's only a 3-year-old organization. Part of it is it's significantly under-resourced. And part of it is it had to make a choice on what to focus on. And naturally, some things didn't get focused. But we doubled down on CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and really made investments in it and gave it new powers to do its job. And then finally, we had to strengthen those parts of the government that are responsible for critical infrastructure. So the Department of Energy with energy, the Environmental Protection Agency with water. And there's a very uneven level of support across those agencies for their infrastructures. And so we created a law that said explicitly, this is your sector risk management responsibilities, and you will be held accountable for this. And hopefully we'll resource you to do this mission. But we have a very inconsistent infrastructure landscape. For example, financial services, especially at the high end, the large banks, is reasonably secure. They have there are several banks that spend more than every federal agency except the Department of Defense on cybersecurity. They spend more than $500 million a year. They have operations centers that would make a 3- or 4-star general blush. That doesn't mean everything's running properly at those banks, but it does mean there's a level of investment and commitment. But then you go down, we identified pipeline security, which unfortunately, DarkSide doubled down on our identification of that recently at Colonial. We identified water, and we identified a few others. Why this is important is that we have to invest in all of these areas. Now, look, we were successful in those areas. We were unable to pass the legislation necessary for building a public-private partnership, and our ability to put money into budgets was also substandard. We only got about 40% of our appropriation recommendations. That is, plussing up investments in specific agencies to do their job. We're only about 40% successful. We would have liked to have been higher. Now, things changed dramatically. SolarWinds, Hafnium, Colonial, I mean, these have all come together. So there was a 1.7 billion flowed into the cybersecurity coffers, through the last COVID bill. And this is a cybersecurity budget for the federal government that's about 18 billion a year. So that was a good, healthy 10% plus up. And when you consider none of it was the Department of Defense, which is about 50% of the budget, it was really about a 20% plus up for the .gov, or the civilian side of our government. But as we look into 2021, we really have to get a good understanding of how we build that public-private collaboration. We have to have more success. And again, I think Colonial has really helped us. One of the things that came out of Colonial was just a complete failure to provide security standards to them, a complete failure to assess or inspect Colonial by its infrastructure support agency, which is the Transportation Security Agency. The people who kind of monitor your travel in and out of the United States also have pipeline security. Don't ask me how we got to that point, although I was involved in it 23 years ago, and I'm embarrassed that we're at this point. The second issue is that there was very little incident reporting, and the company did not feel compelled to traffic much with the U.S. government. So those three incidents, SolarWinds, Hafnium, and then particularly Colonial Pipeline, have given us some impetus. So I think you will see big changes in our public-private collaboration. And I think the most important one is systemically important critical infrastructure. This is the idea that you can identify and then attempt to protect and defend the most critical companies in your country that, if targeted and exploited by an adversary, say Russia or China, it could produce really catastrophic consequences for your economy, your national security, or your public health and safety. So with that said, I think this isn't Ted's dry cleaner down the street. This is Florida Power or Southern Company that provides most of the power to the Southeast United States. And what we'd have to do is identify what those critical functions are, the several hundred companies that own and operate our most important critical infrastructure. And then we're going to have to make a compact with those companies. And that compact says, look, we are going to burden you with requirements, and we're going to provide you benefits. But together, what this does is it's going to raise the overall level of our cybersecurity and make us more effective. Not that we can prevent everything, that's not going to happen. But this has as much to do with responding to an incident and recovering from an incident in a more graceful manner. So, what this will require is, after we designate these companies, they'll have to comply with cybersecurity performance standards based on identified risk to that specific type of business operation. So this will be done for banks, it would be really led by their normal regulator, or for energy, for energy production facilities, it would be led by the FERC and the Department of Energy's regulatory arms. And then what would happen was, once they have these specific requirements, they would have to attest to the fact that they're meeting the standards, and then there would be third-party assessment to ensure that those performance standards are being met. That's the first burden. The second burden, and big burden, is that these companies are going to have to report all cyber incidents, and not in days or weeks, but in minutes or hours, depending on what type of incident it is, so that we can have a good indication of the pressures that our infrastructure is under at any one time, and more easily see indications of a comprehensive attack. In return for those burdens, there will be benefits to these companies. First, we have to improve their intelligence support. We'll create the authorizations for the Director of National Intelligence to share any intelligence indicating a cyber threat to their companies, but also to tailor how we collect intelligence to acknowledge the fact that these critical infrastructures are in fact national assets that have to be protected. That has not been the traditional collection mechanism of our national intelligence agencies. And finally, and probably most importantly, the companies, if they meet the security certification requirements, if the assessments are satisfactory, and they're subject to an attack from an advanced persistent team or a large criminal enterprise, they'll be free of liability associated with that loss of services. This assumes no dereliction by the company, but they'd get some liability protection. So what you ended up with are benefits and burdens, and we think this is the model that most democracies are going to have to go through. Most countries that don't have state-owned, significant state-owned enterprises, you're going to have to do a better job building this public-private compact. So you're going to see a big push for us on that. Final thing I'll point out. We had required a cyber mission force structure assessment. This is on the offensive side. We recognized that, so we put into law that said, look, the current size of cyber mission force, we'll say 133 teams, 6,000 on-net operators. That was based on 2012 threat assessments and 2013 kind of mission sets. Well, as Eric has mentioned, the mission sets have changed with this persistent engagement. The threat assessments of China and Russia have changed. It's clear that they need another, and our estimate was between 30 and 50%. We were exceptionally, and so we ordered up a force structure assessment that says over the next 24 months, come back with the builds to get yourself up to the proper size. Well, General Nakasone has already shown back up, reportedly, this is in the U.S. press, with a 10% growth already just in this year. That this year they'll begin to fund a 2-year growth of 10%. So I would guess that would be from 133 cyber teams in the cyber mission force to 147 teams. We think this is a great down payment of what will eventually be a 30 to 40 to 50% growth over 4, 5, 6 years. So we're seeing some success in this critical infrastructure I talked about. We'll have to see if we can get the law through, but we're having a lot more success post-colonial on the Hill getting this kind of thing through. So I think what you'll see long term at the end of this year when the commission stands down, if we're able to get these last couple things done, is we'll have been able to, through both authorities and appropriations, improve our overall investment in defense. Through the authorities we're giving and the laws we're passing, improve that public-private collaboration. And finally, through the appropriations and the work with the Department of Defense, improve the commitment in instantiating defend forward as a concept. If we can do those three things, then I think we'll have met the overall goals of the report. Excited to take any questions on these issues, but I pass it back to you, Amy.
Thank you so much, Mark. And we do have quite a few questions to go through, so should be a good discussion. First one is, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission is a fully public document. What do you think is the reason for this decision, and what effect do you expect this to have in the broader international context? So maybe Brandon, if I ask you to kick this off, and then Erica and Mark, if you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I think Mark can speak best about why it was so public. But in many ways, we avoided having a classified annex and the type of things that happen quite commonly in this field. And it was a goal of ours to avoid that because it's important to signal exactly what we're doing. And it gets back to the basic Dr. Strangelovian idea of why didn't you tell them? So if we're going to develop a strategy to discourage cyber actions, we need to communicate such strategy. And that was very much important for us, and it's very much important for national security. So everything we're doing is out in the open because this is a very open process, because cyber is one of the most, despite it being covert, is one of the most known and open domains that we've ever seen for conflict.
Mark, I'll pick up on that. So Brandon's right. For the strategic reason, you had in the signaling reason, you had this openness. At a process level, this really comes from Senator McCain. McCain wanted law done from this. The only reason he supported the commission, he was not a big fan of commissions, was that he wanted legislative proposals. One of the good things about the United States and most of our democratic allies is that our laws are unclassified. Secret laws aren't really good laws. So we really needed to write the report in the medium in which we would write the laws. And that medium was the unclassified environment. So we worked really hard. It was hardest on Erica working in her Task Force 1 area. But for all of us, we wrote in the unclassified medium. Sometimes we were informed by classified knowledge, but the whole idea was to be able to write law at the end of it, and to write law, the best law is unclassified law. And to do that, we needed to stay unclassified.
Erica, would you like to add anything to that? Are you happy?
I think my colleagues basically covered it, but I would just emphasize again, I think that there's an inherent value in transparency, and I think it reflects, broadly speaking, democratic values, and something that was important for the commission. And the one audience that wasn't mentioned was the American people itself. And so this was something that it was important, I think, for our commissioners that we had a transparent process and a public-facing document that would be sort of consumable by the American people, and in addition to, of course, our allies and partners and other constituents in within the government, but the American people is an important consumer, particularly given the role of every individual in helping secure the resilience of the cyber ecosystem. And then finally, I guess I would just add that in addition to the fact that we don't have sort of secret laws in democracy, if we need to work, if collaborating with the private sector is meant to be a foundation of the strategy, then to be able to more seamlessly and easily facilitate bringing that stakeholder into the room, those conversations have to be transparent and open and not secret. And so I think that was another motivation behind the transparency of our initiative.
Brilliant, thank you. And another question where I think all of you can answer is, this discussion, this panel was originally set to take place last year at CyCon 2020 and was, of course, cancelled due to COVID. Since then, there have been various developments that you've mentioned. How have your assessments of the Commission changed over the last year?
I'll go first on that as the executive director. What I'll say is, first, I think in the year since CyCon 2020 was scheduled, we've gotten a lot. At CyCon 2020, we would have had the product and the aspiration. And I probably would have briefed, we might get 10 to 12 legislative proposals done. So the first thing I'll tell you is we were a lot more successful. And believe it or not, COVID helped our commission. Just the way we worked, having legislators, we had constant virtual access to the congressional staffs, and we were able to work actually more efficiently in a COVID environment. That is not a common attribute. And so we were fortunate in that regard. We got more done. I did not understand the value of Representative Langevin, Representative Gallagher, Senator King, Senator Sass to the process. This is where Senator McCain was really enlightened. He insisted on these 4 members being there, over the objection of other senators and congressmen who didn't want current legislators on commissions. Usually you have former legislators on commissions. But McCain insisted on it, and the insight he had really came forward with a lot more. The second thing I would say is Colonial and SolarWinds and others have given us a second life. Again, if you'd asked me 6 months ago or last November how much we're going to get done this legislative cycle, I would have thought 5 to 10 proposals maximum. Now I think it's more realistic, 15 to 20, and 2 very significant ones are in play that I don't think were before. So the adversary over the last year has moved our goalpost, a little closer. He's made it more clear to both the American public, but also American companies and our legislators that action is required. So I'm more optimistic every 6 months. That's probably because the condition's more pessimistic.
Yeah, I would add that our work has gotten more important. But the other thing, too, is that we have learned to work virtually. And that demonstrates a change in DC, because it's always been said that if you're outside of Virginia and Maryland, that you don't exactly have an impact on U.S. policy. But that's obviously changed. And I remember quite fondly one of our senators and commissioners took very many meetings on an RV. So we were able to work from just about anywhere. And that just demonstrated that things have changed. And I look forward to our future, including more people in the policy process. Erica?
Yeah, no, I definitely concur with that as someone who was physically based in the New York metro area and traveling to Washington for a lot of the commission's work. I think it's we've sort of validated the idea that we can work in a dispersed and virtual environment. I would also add that the pandemic gave us the opportunity to expand our work product. We put out a number of different white papers between March 2020 and today, one of which actually explored the implications of the pandemic for how we think about, the implications of our work on cybersecurity for how we think about the pandemic, particularly given the increasing importance of the digital environment for continuing for enabling all of our economies to continue to function during this pandemic. So that was an important opportunity, as well as a supply chain white paper and others. And so, I think that we were able to capitalize where we could on opportunities, despite being in a very challenging, global crisis.
Brilliant, thank you. We have had a number of questions come in on the theme of deterrence and layered deterrence, so I'm going to try and bundle a few of those up for you. First one is, how can other allies, NATO countries, or the alliance in general, fit within the principles outlined by the Commission on the issue of layered deterrence thinking? And more broadly, how does the Commission, how do we deal with the fact that some of these concepts might be considered out of date by some of the community, talking about deterrence, talking about persistent engagement? If I pass back to Erica first, maybe, then Mark, then Brandon.
Sure. No, those are great questions. And I guess just to take the first part of the question about the role of allies and partners, it was essential in terms of our thinking on the Commission's work, even though we were focused on the United States, because that was the purpose of our commission. As Mark mentioned, and I think as Brandon mentioned too, we did a number of engagements with international partners, and allies and partners were a critical element in our strategic thinking, both in terms of the sort of more obvious, straightforward areas where where we advocated for more robust cyber diplomacy and for the United States to work to engage and work collaboratively with allies and partners to promote and sustain and enforce norms of acceptable behavior. But also in the sort of more offensive or sort of proactive areas of Defend Forward. Task Force 1, for instance, had a number of analysis and recommendations about how to think about defending forward in cooperation or coordination with allies and partners. And I think we've seen this in implementation a bit, as there have been more instances that have been publicly reported of sort of the implementation of hunt forward missions that have involved DoD collaborating with the defense forces of allies and partners to proactively sort of threat hunt on allied and partner networks and share information with appropriate stakeholders. So I think it was certainly a deliberate part of our process and of our sort of philosophy in thinking about the strategy and its implementation. The second question about whether deterrence is kind of a outdated concept, I would sort of respectfully disagree with the premise, both on philosophical grounds and also on sort of policymaking grounds, because the reality is that this is the foundation of U.S. cyber policy. And so this is how practitioners within the federal government are thinking and operating on a daily basis. And so I think that it's not that these concepts are outdated. Rather, I think the Commission took the perspective that we need to sort of reject the outdated sort of Cold War nuclear deterrence-based models because they are not the right fit for strategic challenges in cyberspace, and instead articulate a vision for deterrence that makes sense for this domain. And this gets at, what I was saying earlier and what Brandon was saying as well, how we measure success and think about outcomes. It's not sort of the absence of the use of force at all, but rather being more deliberate about how we define what are the things we are trying to reduce the magnitude and frequency of. How do we define what's systemically important? You can't ever get to zero in cyberspace. And so, rather than sort of throw the deterrence baby out with the bathwater, we aim to sort of reimagine this concept and make it meaningful for this domain in particular. But I'm sure Brandon will have more to say on this topic.
Oh, no, not at all. Exactly what Erica said is exactly right and exactly important. The only thing I would add is that probably the most disappointing thing about the pandemic is we didn't get a chance to really promote our ideas in person. But on the other hand, we started doing a lot of virtual presentations and virtual options that maybe reach more people. But we missed out on the dinners. We missed out on the happy hours, the things that people do to communicate in this policy space. And I look forward to getting back to that soon. Mark?
I don't, but to each their own. What I would say is that the allies, I'll go back on the first part, the allies and partners issue. Look, most of our allies and partners are democracies. Most democracies suffer from the problem of competing in the gray zone, where your adversary, Russia or China or a criminal actor, is operating below the level at which you're going to respond. And this is very hard for democracy. So I think what we wrote is equally true. You absolutely have to defend yourself, because there'll be times when you don't do any, where the idea of cost imposition isn't effective. So I think you have to do that. But I also think you need to develop your cost imposition capabilities below that level of the traditional use of force. And that's where Defend Forward comes in. So I think what we wrote is equally applicable to allies and partners. One other thing I'd add is attribution. Attribution is going to be critical in two ways. One, getting information from our allies and partners so we can do more effective attribution, since an adversary may have moved through their electronic battle space. But then secondly, providing attribution more rapidly. Not too long, within the last year, the US and UK were excited that we were able to name an attack in Georgia on Russia and attribute it explicitly to them 3 months after it happened. Attribution needs to move into the minutes and hours, not the days, weeks, and months that we tend to have now. And part of that is being able to share information more fluidly, more flexibly, more agilely with your allies and partners.
Brilliant, thank you. And with 2 minutes on the clock, I'll shoot one quick question back to Mark. Is the federal government going to pay for third-party audits of critical national infrastructure companies? What does this private-public cooperation look like going forward?
So that'll be one of the things we negotiate in there. I think it'll, look, most of these companies already do the third-party assessments as part of their cyber insurance portfolios. So I think we'll be okay. What it'll be is they'll have to be done to a standard that the government is establishing. And I think that'll be the difference. And to the degree that there's a delta in that cost, maybe the federal government would be involved in it. But I think that's a minor element of this overall bill. And like, as I said, we're talking about 200 to 250 of our biggest critical functions. I think the vast majority are doing those self-assessments now. Not 100%. And I would have warned you that pipelines, water, wastewater, and big human health service providers were three of the ones where we felt we had a weakness, and there may not have been those assessments going on. So we'll have to see what happens. But I think it's actually a minor element of this is that cost. But if it's necessary, I think that's something the government could do.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And of course, there are questions streaming in, and we could be here for a while, but we are out of time. So huge thank you to the audience for your engagement, and a huge thank you to Erica, Brandon, and Mark. It's been brilliant to have you here, and we wish you the best with all your future endeavors on the Commission. Thank you.
Thanks.